All right. That doesn't happen very often. So, well, thank you, Brian, and it's my pleasure to be here this morning. My name is Josh Lofton. If you don't know me, I'm the cropping system specialist down here at Oklahoma State University. A couple of weeks ago, Brian asked me if I want to talk about double crop corn during this session, and you know, we kind of pondered back and forth whether we wanted to or not. Brian was gracious enough, and by the way, there's going to be voting at the end of this presentation, to come up with this title, is double crop corn really it's a thing? I came up with an alternative title, which is what you're going to get to judge on the end of the presentation, of double crop corn. No, we didn't misspell soybean. It's kind of a new system, and that's kind of why Brian wanted me to talk about it, because it is so new and we're kind of just on the surface learning the system. I talked to Brian Vincent last night, and you know, we kind of went back and forth on the fact that
Josh,
figure out something new every year.
Can you drop your?
And then we get caught with 2 or 3 mistakes we feel like we shouldn't. Here, let me turn off my.
Yeah, our internet's unstable on campus.
Turn off my video. Well, my video is already off, so okay. So, can you hear me better now, Brian?
Yeah, you sound a lot better.
Okay. Yeah, so really new system. This should really be more of a discussion, which I'm hoping if folks are interested to get some questions and we can kind of talk through some of it. But you know, this double crop corn system, very new, very unique. But it's kind of one of those things that we're learning a lot as we go. Just to kind of go first into double crop systems, kind of that way we know what we're talking about. And there's also some challenges unique to double crop system that are pretty universal no matter what system you go into. So when we talk about double crop, we're looking at 2 crops, 2 harvests of a crop in a single calendar year. In our case, and in most of the case throughout the United States, this double crop is a wheat soybean system, kind of like the picture you see on the top. But it can be about anything. We've seen a lot of small grains kind of start popping up to where we have just a small grain in soybean. We still have seen some canola, some folks back east, and as we get into states like Arkansas and Tennessee, down in southern Texas, we've seen some canola into a double crop. But the big thing that we have in Oklahoma is because we have such vast amount of summer crops folks are interested in, that we've started to see a lot of variability in the summer crops. Now, what I wanted to do is say, you know, a couple things we are not talking about in this system. We aren't talking about relay cropping or this intercropping system where you plant a secondary crop in an actively growing primary crop. We are looking at that, but this is not what we're going to be talking about today. We are not talking about planting after graze out or hay. While you can consider that maybe a crop, we're going to try to hold to the truest of form and look at grain crop into a grain crop. We're not talking about cover crops on the same regard as we want two physical harvests. And then we're not going to talk about the folks that up north that do a double crop where they have a summer crop like corn, and then they go into a winter crop, and that's what they think of as a double crop. We are talking about a winter crop as the primary first crop, and then a summer crop as a successive crop. So double crops are very common throughout Oklahoma, depending on the year, and I think depending on the value of the wheat that we have out there. I always say that when we have really good wheat years, we're going to have a lot more double crop than we will full season on any given year, just due to the fact that most of those folks want to take that wheat to harvest. So with wheat being such a major crop throughout this primary region and small grains in general, we see a lot of this trying to sneak in that summer crop. And we've seen more and more come in as summer crops become more of a viable and interest in our production systems. As we get better genetics, better management, we're going to see this come in. Also, from an environmental standpoint, it's very valuable because it does delay a lot of our really critical growth stages until later in the season. Think about going through reproductive growth of a lot of our crops instead of in July, but we're going through in August and September. So much better conditions, typically a lot higher humidity, a lot better rainfall, cooler temperatures, cooler nighttime temperatures, which when you get into summer crops, your nighttime temperatures play a really big role. And then whenever you look at some crops, you'll get better seed quality at harvest. And that's kind of one we'll talk about today is corn. You'll see this here in the slide when we talk about the detriments or the challenges with the double crop system, but the later harvest can improve some of our seed quality and our harvestability. So the challenges, this is something that we have to overcome for all of our systems, is a lot of these challenges. I try to keep these fairly universal. Since we are planting later, we are planting well outside the optimum conditions in most cases. When we talk about soybeans that are photoperiod sensitive, this can drive a lot of management practices differently because we have to work with the days constantly getting shorter or the nights constantly getting longer as that soybean plant is growing. In corn, it can be a blessing or a curse that we're more that we factor more around heat units. Why? Because we can kind of manage that a little bit better. We can kind of predict when the best time to do certain things is based on heat unit accumulations. But in this regard, most of our crops have this hard and fast set line that they have to get to before they can go reproductive. And so if we don't meet that hard and fast line, we could potentially not get there and it not be any fault of ours, just it would be the year. The planting conditions are typically not as friendly. You typically have a very short window because of how hot and often how dry it can be in those, once we're taking that winter crop off. So think about those conditions we typically get mid-June through July can be a lot worse than what we get in April and May when we typically plant our summer crops. And then harvest conditions, you're typically cooler, so the dry down's a lot longer, and we can have plants stretch well into November, December, maybe even into the new year before we can actively take them out of the field. You can have periods of extended moisture, which whenever you're not talking about something like corn, you're talking about soybean, that can be quite a bit of a detriment to seed quality in that regard. And like I said, you have to be okay with a much later harvest. So we'll kind of get into the question of why corn, why not soybean? Soybean is something we've looked at and a lot of folks have looked at throughout the United States as a double crop, and it is kind of that most popular option if you want to see, primary row crop production is, and the point's not to replace soybean. The point is to say, maybe there's systems that soybean work really well. Maybe there's system that grain sorghum work really well and corn won't, but maybe there is some systems to where corn will work really well. It's not meant to have us replace one with the other. It's more along the lines of having better options available for our summer crop within our double crop system. Having all of those just kind of adds a lot of flexibility. You can play the markets a little bit better. Maybe moisture conditions at certain times. We'll talk about how the difference in timing of some of these systems are. And how we can play the moisture conditions and timing of operations. Previous management, something if you sprayed some sort of herbicide on your wheat, maybe you can't go into corn or sorghum, but maybe you can go into beans. And then potential pest pressure. I left it as pest pressure, but I put weeds in the parenthesis because I think weeds are your primary. Getting around pest pressure in these double crop systems is fairly difficult. But we want to see, do you have a problem with grasses? Maybe grain sorghum is not your best double crop. But if you have a, really bad pigweed issue, maybe soybean, especially with the challenges associated with Roundup and potentially our auxins this year, maybe soybean isn't your best issue if you've relied on them in the past to make the system work. So once we kind of say, okay, we're going to look at corn in a double crop system, we have to go to the great scholars. And look for advice. And that's when I typically go to Ian Malcolm and say, we're oftentimes saying whether we could do this system and not focusing first on whether we should. Should we be looking at corn? Is it something that's even viable? Not just the fact that can we make it work? Sure, we can make it work, but should we be making it work? And so I go back to the first time I was looking at double crop corn. We were actually looking at the winter crop before our double crop systems and seeing if there was a difference between wheat and canola going into our summer double crop cash crop system. So that's what the table that we have here. We have 4 different summer crops that we evaluated in a double crop system, being grain, sorghum, soybean, corn, and sesame. The previous crop, in all of these was either wheat, canola, or the delayed canola. What we did with the delayed canola is we typically would harvest that in the last part of May, first part of June, and then we would wait until we typically harvested the wheat plots to plant that double crop system. So depending on the year, that could have been 2, 3, even 4 weeks down the line after we harvested the canola crop when we planted that double crop system. Good set of data. We actually have a fact sheet available with all of this information and some digestion of this data. So I don't want to get into it too much because we are on a time crunch today. But what I did want to do is focus on that corn and look at the viability in the system. So we see that, there is a little bit of a drag with canola compared to wheat. Oftentimes this is due to planting date, and we'll talk about that here in a slide or two. But it also, when you're talking about double crop corn, you almost need a residue. You almost need something there to kind of hold in some of that late season moisture as it's getting up and getting going before we can rely on those August and September rains. But when we look at an average of the bushels that we produce throughout the trial, grain sorghum produced about 70 to 75 bushels. It's great in this trial. Soybean across the years produced 26 to 34 bushels. That's fantastic. That's great in the double crop system. And then our corn was around 58 to 65 bushels. And that's something that you have to get over whenever you're doing this double crop corn is you might not be able to hit that triple digit number as far as bushels on corn, but this is actually a decent yield on the double crop corn system, as long as you can make it work economics wise. So we found here that, because of that it was kind of a viable system. This slide kind of highlights what I was talking about on the corn. The emergence and the early season vigor with wheat and canola were pretty similar. But what we saw is on the back end, we had a lot more drought stress with corn going behind canola compared to wheat. Oftentimes we thought because of one, the delayed planting, but also two, because of the residue effect. So it's viable. So we've gone through the thing of it potentially could be viable. Now we have to see if it actually fits into our system. So going back to Ian Malcolm, not whether we could, but should we be doing it? And the question becomes, when should we plant? When do we need to be planting this system? So what I wanted to do is I went to Mesonet, great source that we have, and we can look at heat and heat units accumulations. Once again, we talked about corn being driven on heat units, and so we could almost predict when we could reach particular stages. So that's what I did with this slide here. So we have 2 different years that I wanted to highlight. They're actually the last year that I did double crop corn, 2020 last year, and the first year I looked at double crop corn, which was 2016. Heat units accumulation, this is day of the year here. For these 2 crops. Our planting dates, this first line is June 1, second line is June 20th, the third line, is July 4th, and the fourth line is July 15th. And so what we did here is we assumed a couple of things. One, we assumed that we need 2,700 heat unit accumulations to reach maturity. The different colors is emergence, prior to emergence. Green is vegetative, and then yellow would be reproductive growth. This line is at 2,700 heat unit accumulations, and then the red line is our first freeze date. Now this is a hard freeze, so we're sub 32. When we did this heat unit accumulations, as we got later into the fall, we had some days to where we didn't have a positive heat unit. We just zeroed that out at 0. They weren't negative, they were just 0 at that point. And if the next day was positive, we just continue to add to the system. So a couple of things that we see is that if you planted June 1st, June 20th, on this year, you reached 2,700 heat unit accumulations without any problem. We were able to go to maturity before the first freeze date. Was a great system. When we went to July 4th, now what I do say is kind of that first rainfall after July 4th here. We ran into a first frost at around 2,500. And if you're familiar with corn, that's right after true dent. So we were kind of in between that true dent stage and our black layer. So whenever you talk about maturity and yield potential, once you get into dent, you're at about 75% yield realized. You still have about 25%, and I think this was at about half dent. So we're looking at about maybe a 10 to 15 potential yield loss reduction, solely just looking at heat unit accumulations, not looking at anything else. If we waited till mid-July to plant last year, we were well pre-dent. We were actually in soft or kind of getting into that soft dough, hard dough stage, and we were really immature. Folks that planted in this kind of time frame last year didn't really get their crop out and didn't have a great time because we did run into that first frost date. It was an early year though. It was an early year. We look at 2016, you don't see a red line because it's about 10 days out here outside of the graph. So we didn't have a frost date that is any concern. All of our crops, indifferent of planting date, were able to reach maturity with no problem. The one thing that I do caution and I do worry about in these kind of systems is you see the accumulation of heat units kind of trail off as we get going. That's something that we really have to look at. The other thing we need to look at is, looking at June 1 and June 15th, maybe that's the right time to plant. Well, what I've done is I've highlighted a box around July, the month of July. And what we don't want, the reason we are doing this is to not go through reproductive growth period during that July hot and drought. And so when we look at things like that early June, that mid-June, we are going to sit in a situation to where July becomes a bigger issue. July 4th planting date, we kind of get out of that because we are definitely within vegetative growth during that July period. That July 15th, we're well outside, but once again, we run into some late season issues. So kind of looking into that and coming back to the question of when do we plant, this is probably the biggest difference in most of our double crop systems. It's going to vary depending on where you are. The further north into Kansas you get, probably June becomes a more viable option. But what we don't want to do is be planting late and still pollinating in late July and early August, because that's when we get into some skips, poor pollination issue. For central and north central Oklahoma, which is where we did the trials, we're looking at the first good rain after July 4th. That's kind of where we have kind of put our flag in the mud right now. It's not a hill we're willing to die on, but at least based on our initial precursors of information, that first rain after July 4th allows us to typically be far enough along most years in case. Oh, and I did want to say, out of 10 years that I looked at, this is how many years we reach full maturity based on these individual planting dates. So when I go back through here, July 4th kind of left us at that period where we didn't run into July heat, and we had a better chance of getting to that maturity by the end of the year, that first frost. So the next question is hybrid. And I see a lot of folks, whenever they see the system, be like, okay, I want to go into an 80-day hybrid. And that short versus long season is probably a debate that'll be, long-lived. What you're kind of looking at here is yield potential versus risk. Shorter season hybrids, those 80-day hybrids, those low 90s, we do have less risk of early season freeze, but our yield potential is usually a lot less. And the other thing is we don't want to mess up screwing or transitioning from that vegetative to reproductive growth quicker, because then we could just be transitioning during that really bad period as well. We've kind of seen, and then also several other universities have seen that your typical hybrid period, that 110, 115 is probably the best if you can get that many heat accumulation dates. Others have said if they had problems getting accumulated heat dates, that we're looking more towards the mid to late 90-day hybrids and should be pretty good. The other thing is to remember other attributes of your corn hybrid as well. When you get too young, we start setting our ear really low, and a low ear set, a couple feet off the ground is not what we want. We want a good knee to hip high ear set, and really you need a longer hybrid to kind of ensure that does happen. Planting rate is something that gets discussed a lot and on everything, and that's kind of what we'll finish out here. The intent is to try to get more with less, and I am running short on time here, so I'll kind of go through this. But on double crop, we typically want to bump that seeding rate up a bit. But the question is, on corn, we've been looking to decrease seeding rate universally across the board, especially in our more drought-prone areas. So what we did is we looked at double crop seeding rate, and this is kind of the yields that we got, our yield potential, corn grain yield in bushels, and our seeding rate. This is actual plants per acre, the way that we did the trial. We see that we did get almost a tier step up, but it's kind of hard to say what would you have got on full season. So we actually did this trial comparing full and double crop. And so the full season, we had a kind of a gradual step up to about 17.5. And then we kind of had a flattening or a slight decrease over time when we got more seed. We didn't really see that. We almost saw a plateauing or maybe a quick step up here at the 2,700. So we started asking ourselves the question, why did we get that? You know, is this something that we really wanted to see something this far out? This trial was also looking at nitrogen management. And this is kind of what we saw from our full season. But in the interest of time, I will go ahead and skip to our double crop. And this at 0 pounds of nitrogen per acre is, I think, the reason why we saw that 2,700 or 27,000 do so well. Because we got a very significant increase in 27,000 compared to some of our other ones. Otherwise, when you put a viable amount of nitrogen out, you got very similar yields between the 17.5, the 22, and the 2,700. So I do believe that 17.5 to 22,000 is kind of right where we need to be. So maybe a smidgen up of what we've seen in our full season to be a big issue. I will say there are other things you need to talk about. Like we said, pest pressure being a very big thing on the back end. We had earworm issues pretty much universally across our double crop systems. Something you have to look into. Stem borers is one thing you have to kind of really get into. And then if the conditions are right, you know, talking to a lot of folks that do this double crop corn system, southern rust becomes one that you almost have to budget in for an application into southern rust. If you don't have to make that application, that's fine. But southern rust is going to be a potential major issue because of the lateness and potential conditions associated with that corn growth. And we get into that more hot, humid, and wet conditions that southern rust can start popping up a little bit more. So with that, I finish off by saying, should we do it? It's kind of a risk-reward scenario. Is it better than other double crops? Yes and no. It really depends. I think I go back to the fact that it's another option. It's a good another option, especially when corn prices are very favorable. We are kind of walking a line on risk and reward to where we're right on a heavy risk with potentially very high reward. So we have to be okay with walking that line. You have to be okay with not seeing 120, 150 bushel corn. That's something that this system has a hard time doing. And you have to be okay with that diminished corn yield and shoot for that new yield potential instead of what you would typically do in a full season. It's still a new idea. And like I said in the beginning, it's better to kind of have a discussion about this. Soybean was a really bad idea 20 years ago. But what we've seen is our genetics and our management have gotten a lot better, and therefore those systems have gotten a lot better. And so we can get a lot better of a system with this double crop corn scenario when we actually go through and have a little bit more time to have us test it out, the growers test it out, and see it across a wide range of things. But yeah, I think it's still a really good system that is fairly viable across the southern Great Plains, maybe a little more in Oklahoma than Kansas because of heat unit accumulations, but it's still a very viable option that should be considered if you have a system that'll kind of fit it. So with that, sorry, Brian, I was kind of a little long on that, but
you're a minute short, so you're good.
Once again, this is something that I'd like questions on because I think it's still one of those things that is a lot to be learned. So can I answer Josh Bashan sent me a direct message asking double crop sorghum versus double crop corn, when would you favor one over the other? It's a great question, Josh. And so if I want to be having most of my double crop sorghum in the ground earlier than July 4th, that's kind of my soft date. That's kind of one area because, like I said in my presentation, we kind of are moving towards that after July 4th for corn. So if you have good conditions in June, maybe that's that time for sorghum. If you don't have good conditions in June, maybe it's the thing that you kind of hold out that double crop corn. If you get a nice rainfall shortly thereafter July 4th, we're saying, yeah, we're going to pull the trigger on double crop corn. The other thing is if I'm really grassy, I can handle that in corn. I can't handle that in sorghum. So another thing to consider on that regard. So once again, I don't think there's one over the other in a universal standpoint, but depending on when you get rains in that middle of the summer region, I think can kind of dictate whether you have a good system for corn, a good system for soybean, or a good system for sorghum. And sesame's in there as well. And sesame's in there. I don't want to negate sesame as a potential as well.